A priest stated it's horrible to see that the despair of hunger has led the indigent population to eat cows that have died of carbuncle, knowing and saying that they will soon die from eating them, and eating horses, dogs, cane already chewed by others, pieces of leather, and anything else they can find. It is horror upon horror.
They'll call you an extremist or subversive or red radical. Red radical and fight you.
All right. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another installment of the Subversive History Book Club, where we will be continuing our morbid journey through Mike Davis's Late Victorian Holocausts. Today, we're picking up where we left off. We just finished talking about China in pretty significant detail, and now we'll be talking about the famine and drought situation as it affected Brazil, specifically in the Northeast. Johnny, how'd you feel about the overall chapter?
I thought it was good. Great. I thought it was a very upbeat, uplifting, inspiring message of what people can, do when they just put their heads together, and, just put a lot of hard work into making their situation just a little bit better. No, I'm just kidding. It's another harrowing human experience, just taken from the mind of some depraved, heartless demon that just inhabits the body of a human being.
Absolutely. Without further ado, let's get into it. Philbo, you want to bring up the first text, please? All right, I will. Okay. Meanwhile, half a globe away, the interior of Brazil's Nordeste baked under a relentless sun and cloudless sky. The Sertão is a high, rolling plain broken by smooth top tablelands and rocky monadnocks of decomposing granite. Rainfall is dramatically orchestrated by El Niño, and few landscapes change their aspect so radically between seasons or wet and dry years. Nature here rejoices, wrote Euclides de Cunha in his epic Os Certeros, in a play of antithesis, when after an arduous ride from the coastal Sierra capital of Fortaleza, the famed Harvard geologist Luis Agassiz and his wife first glimpsed the rain-soaked Sertão in April of 1868, they were flabbergasted by its lushness. Expecting a wasteland, they instead beheld a verdant prairie, beautifully green. Yet when Herbert Smith, the special famine correspondent for Scribner magazine, looked down upon the Sierra interior a decade later, it was all antithesis. A dry, cheerless desert scorched with heat. As many as 500,000 Sertanejos had just perished from hunger and smallpox. De Cunha noted ghoulishly that under such conditions, the bodies of dead men and horses were exquisitely mummified by the extreme aridity, without any unseemly decomposition. I
knew you would nail those pronunciations, by the way, because of your interest in Brazilian jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. No, I don't think I did that good. You want to know how bad? You want to know how bad it was?
How bad?
So you see that word Nordeste?
Uh-huh.
I was looking at it, I was like, where is what city is this? I don't understand. What city am I looking for? That's northeast. Nordeste is northeast in Portuguese. I was looking on a map. Actually, go to the image because it's going to show a map. I was looking up maps. I was like, where the fuck is Nordeste on this fucking thing? And then it just kind of came because then I saw Rio Grande del Norte and I was like, oh wait, that's northeast.
Your brain clicked and it's oh fuck.
So you can see here that we're looking at the northeast region of Brazil. So this is a zoomed in on it, but if you look down in the bottom right corner, you can kind of see a more zoomed out, the whole portion of Brazil.
Isn't the whole thing a rainforest though? So where is this prairie happening?
Obviously, it's happening in the northeast, which is far away from the rainforest.
So the rainforest isn't the whole thing.
No.
Okay, so then my rudimentary understanding of the I guess ecology of Brazil is
most of Brazil is the Amazon rainforest.
Yeah.
Right. That's what I was under the impression of. But
Well,
now I'm
you're
being
right.
told there's like a prairie, and I'm like, I'm sorry.
Well,
That's
if you were paying attention to the first thing, it was a lush greenery a couple decades prior, and now it's a desert.
okay.
He was talking about the conflicting testimonies of the two different people that visited there.
Right.
Those people said it was like verdant greenery and lush and this and that. And then the next person that went around this time was like shocked that it was like an arid prairie.
Well, they were describing a grassland, but I think, like what we're seeing is kind of these cycles of drought, obviously.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
And grasslands they form in a place that is drier. So, I think like right here we're kind of seeing parts that are like not the main, Amazon River basin. They're like smaller rivers. So like it's while it is like 90% of the country, I'm sure, like even the rainforest itself has like different biomes in it where you have like temperate parts closer to the Andes and the tops of the watershed, as opposed to like the more basin type stuff where the mangroves or whatever.
See, my entire conception of like Brazil as a country is informed by the lesser known sequel to Oregon Trail, which is the like I think it was called like the Rainforest Trail, right? This is like a 90s like sequel.
Are you making this up?
I swear it's either a fever dream or it's a totally real thing that I remember from school.
The rainforest.
It's fascinating. I mean, it would make sense that they would potentially make a similar kind of story, game based off that kind of story because, like,
you're like going down the Amazon
colonial process,
Yeah. We're just like being indoctrinated from childhood to be like, you're going on a civilization.
Frontiersman. Okay, so a couple other things that I want to point out in here. This drought within the Northeast began 6 months after the failure of the summer monsoon in India. So 6 months after what we were reading about in India, 6 months later, the rains failed in the Northeast of Brazil. Historian Roger Cunniff, who is actually quoted several times throughout this chapter, said most sertanejos crossed the narrow line between hope for a belated winter and total despair during the first 2 weeks of April. Having already lost 2 plantings in the false winters of January and March, they fearfully refrained from casting what remained of their dwindling supplies when light rains appeared, lest they have nothing at all for the long treks which were already beginning, or to sustain themselves for the long months of drought most were now sure were upon them. So then also there actually is also a later, like people have said that attributed that this drought had been due to the extreme deforestation which had been provoked by the increasing cultivation of cotton. So you know how we saw like cotton production went up like 6 times. Apparently that was associated with a significant degree of deforestation that some attribute this drought, at least maybe some of its extreme conditions, to that process of deforestation.
I mean, that's not that crazy because, like, if I'm not mistaken, like cotton requires like an insane amount of water.
Probably, yeah. Yeah,
and in addition, like the soils in the region, just due to the rain cycles, like they are more susceptible to drying out. So, that's. I know we're not talking about like the heavily forested regions that we, these conversations tend to focus on now, but it's like a similar kind of dynamic of like if you're disrupting these soil ecologies that play a huge role in maintaining like a certain kind of hydrological cycle, disrupting that, will have a broad effect on these. And I think, we saw that play out in India. We probably saw that play out in China, and, it's going to be happening here. And I think that's kind of the point of going into detail, is to highlight these like patterns that are exacerbated as capitalism expands.
Right. 100%. So just a couple notes that I'm going to point out before we get to the next text situation. So, this is already beginning. The drought is occurring. There's charity coming from one end, and there's also riots coming from those who are starving. Both of those only postponed the most extreme form of starvation that would occur in the midsummer. Even the formerly well-off like plantation owners, that you could refer to them as, traded their slaves for grain and deserted their dying ranches for the towns. So like even the more well-off landowners that had slaves were selling their slaves just for food effectively, and then we're abandoning you can call them ranches or plantations or whatever you want to refer to them as, farms. there was so much desperation that people were eating plants, and some of them were eating these extremely poisonous plants that rendered them completely blind. By September and October, dozens were dying daily in fetid refugee camps on the outskirts of town. This is another thing that I want to say, and this is like, another one of the glaring contradictions or issues with capitalism. A handful of opportunist merchants gouged spectacular profits without relieving any of the hunger in the interior. The few baskets of mandioca meal which were available were retailed by the merchants at fabulous prices, frequently 8 or 10 times above the normal, so that only the rich could buy. It's funny. This makes me think of when hurricanes come, there's actually laws, it's called panic gouging. That's illegal in the United States to do. And it's funny that you have to set that
for
up.
Now.
It's funny that that needs to be arranged, because the free market ideology, that's just supply and demand. It's
right.
in demand.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of supply. Why can't I spend $50 on a case of water?
Well, and I find this is it's striking that it's happening around the time of the second, or the Paris Commune, the 1870 Paris Commune and stuff like that, where it's there's similar economic issues kind of beginning to be discussed on a mass scale. And right now we're just kind of seeing this as the quote unquote frontiers of capitalism. And, but it's, just kind of the similar patterns that have, played out in Europe, also playing out in the colonial peripheries, and but just to a greater extreme, because they're maintained by more violence, than the metropoles.
Right. And it's also important to note, and this is quoted from the book, in Brazil at this time, which is still largely administered by Portuguese colonial agents. Not in I don't think it's formal. I think British is nominally independent at this time, but much like the United States, much like Guatemala, you know what I mean? Independence only really meant that the European settlers now control it irrespective of a mother country, as opposed to actual kind of independence. It's really the colonial powers that settled there now are just running the show without giving tribute back to the mother country across the Atlantic. So above that of Herbert Spencer, had made rampant inroads in liberal thinking, while the conservatives followed a church hierarchy that preached that the drought was God's punishment to Brazil for accepting the materialistic ways of the 19th century. And they said, against God, there is no virtuous insurrection. And then also the Minister of Imperial Affairs, named Antonio de Costa Pinto, played the role of Sir Richard Temple, if you remember that from the India discussion. Turning mere disaster into catastrophes, he authorized limited food shipments to the Nordeste, meaning Northeast, but otherwise took control of relief expenditure away from the formerly autonomous provincial presidents. So again, we have this current of, Malthusian social Darwinism that is motivating the imperial administrators to not give relief aid because it would harm the individuals that they are, it's God.
They won't learn their lesson.
Well, and God's punishing them for their materialism. So at this
you got to let the kid stick the fork in the outlet. All right.
Got to learn the lesson the hard way.
We can bring up the text number 2 now. Johnny, would you like to read this one for us?
Sure. Drought refugees were spilling out of the desertified interiors of the Serra and the Pernambuco towards oases like the Cariri Valley in southeastern Ceará, Triunfo in Pernambuco, and Acu in Rio Grande do Norte. Far from mitigating the crisis, Cunniff points out, this simply generalized the immiseration to areas where the rains had not failed. The masses of hungry people and cattle carried the destruction of the drought into regions that had escaped the meteorological effects. Triunfo complained that it had been converted into a cattle ranch for the abuse of the poor by the rich. The roving cattle moved into the agrestic regions, smashing the cane, manioc, and other crops. I don't know what a manioc is, but it sounds like that thing from Star Wars in like the Empire one, where they're inside the giant like space worm, and reducing to the last degree of misery and despair the class that lives exclusively from agricultural labor. Human refugees as well consumed and destroyed crops, quickly rendering the traditional agricultural hills and brejos nearly as desperate for food as the drought regions. I apologize if my pronunciations were awful or if anything I said is accidentally a slur.
You know, and this is also something that we saw happen in India as well, that like there might have, like there's these specific areas that are like especially affected by the drought, but then just like because of the disbursement of the population, it kind of like it spreads the effects of the drought to other areas. And not only that, that's not only done by the disbursement of people, but it's because of the economic system. You know what I mean? Because it's not just a drought. The drought causes, in a supply and demand sense, the price of the food to rise because there's a shorter supply of it. So now, even if, let's say, like, you know, you live in like a, you know, imagine 4 counties, right? And imagine they're perfect squares, like, you know, like a 4-square board, right? And say that it only occurred in one of an extreme drought occurred in one. The other 3 had like relatively fine harvests. But the problem is that because the grain output is reduced by 25%, it raises the price, especially when you're administered by like an imperial power that's looking at this, you know, cash crops for export. Everything's going to rise in price. And now the famine is affecting all 4 of those provinces, as opposed to just the one that's most affected by the by the drought. So Philbo, if you want to bring up image number 2. What do we got here? Okay, yeah, this is an actual photo of a starving family from this area. Yeah, I think this is like one of the only like real photos of like a family like this that I came across while researching this. We can go to text number 3 now, Philbo, if you want to read this one.
Well, I just want to say real quick that it got me thinking, you know, the drought situation that they're describing here has got me thinking about like the American Southwest, which has had civilizations that live there collapse due to like extreme drought. And it's, you know, I don't think it was obviously as dire as this situation. It was more like, okay, we got to like diffuse this large population centers that we've kind of built up and kind of move into, you know, places where the water is at, because it's not here anymore. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whereas like now there's like this other extra thing of the liberal markets being applied over the top of it, which is exacerbating the situation. But the other aspect, you know, to take it back to the Southwest region in modern days, it's like we're seeing right now severe drought in the region, and then like houses being built in places that don't have a water supply that exists, like, you know, like people know that it doesn't last like 15 years into the future, 10 years into the future. Like, so basically these home developers are like developing illegal homes in so many senses. And then it's like people are buying these homes in some of these places. And then it's like, we're going to have a similar kind of like, when this, you know, whatever disaster happens, the drought continues to intensify, you're going to have the similar kind of, you know, out migration of people, you know, internally displaced climate refugees that need to move, you know, that move into, you know, other places. So you're going to see, you know, this kind of things also play out in modern day, which is going to have drastic political implications.
Yeah, when they finally like tap the Colorado River for its last and final drop, like things are going to get real.
Okay, yeah. Do you want to take this one, Philbo?
Yeah. As the population of the Sertão now drew closer to the humid Zona de Mata, the sugar planters and urban merchants were forced to weigh difficult alternatives. The frightened elites vacillated over whether to divert
retirantes. That really just means migrant. I looked that up, what that means. It's like retirante, but it's it really just means migrant. So if you want to just replace that with migrant, that's just the people that are fleeing. Yeah.
Divert the retirantes, migrants, more. Wow, this is a horrific description. More wild beasts than rational human beings. Oh my God. Yeah. To the labor-hungry Amazon, and thereby risk losing part of their surplus workforce, or allow them into cities where, mixing with the slaves and poor artisans, they might pose an insurrectionary threat. In Fortaleza, the pharmacist Rodolfo Teofilo kept a famous diary that chronicled the growing presence of desperate backlanders. The sad procession, he wrote, paraded along the series of streets of the capital at all hours. Real animated skeletons with skin blackened by the dust from the roads and stuck to their bones held out their hands, begging from everyone they met. A wave of looting and theft by refugees was countered by bourgeois vigilantism and lynching that went unpunished because the ritirante was considered a leprous dog, oh my God, who was going to stain the land.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I remember this is the part that stuck out to me where I was like trying to remember like that part where it was like, wait, no, it's not the specter part, but like, yeah, these like people like covered in like soot and dirt, right? You know, just begging and being like murdered like, you know, a stray dog on the road.
Right. Well, and like this, there's several different, you know, several different, you know, things here that are important to note, right? So you have this area like the Sorteo, where this famine hits, it causes what effectively like a refugee crisis in a way, like an internally displaced person, however you want to classify it. And now they're going into these other areas where there's like some more well-off people. Like they were kind of this like peasant population living in this Sorteo. Now they're coming into the other areas. So now there's a couple things that they can do, right? One, they can import them into the Amazon, which is apparently it's labor hungry. Apparently there's a lot of things going on in the Amazon region that require labor. So we can send them there and then they can like have jobs or whatever. But then they don't want to do that because they want to exploit them also. They're like, wait, but if we send them there, then we lose our peasant workforce.
And then we'll have to work.
Exactly. And then the other option is let them stay in the cities. And then, you know, much like in the counter-revolution of 1776, where we talked about this, there's a lot of like fear of insurrectionary situations. They're like, all right, well, now if we bring these poor starving peasants in here, we have all these slaves and these otherwise poor artisans. What if they all start like getting a cohesive class conscious idea of what's going on? What if they hear about this
Paris Commune thing going on?
Yeah.
Can't have that. None of that.
So then you see this, you know, reaction where like, you know, there's vigilantism and lynching where they're being killed as leprous dogs that will be staining the land. So yeah, so that's important to understand is that the bourgeois of the cities are very concerned about the way to move forward with all this. So if you go now to image number 3, I believe this is an illustration. Yes, this is out of the book. This is an illustration called The Exodus. This shows you know, an illustrated drawing of like the plight of the Sorteo as they were migrating. If you go forward,
this kind of reminds me of the cover for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine.
Man, it does actually look eerily similar to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine cover. That's actually wild. That's a very, very good point. If you want to move to the next one, I actually have a real picture of the situation occurring as well. This is actually what it looked like. That's the Sorteo, like actually making their exodus from the Northeast. Well, they remained in the Northeast, but from the Sierra region.
And I think like it is similar and striking to the, you know, the image of the cover of the 100 Years of Palestine that you're talking about. Because like, you know, it is a very similar kind of process of like displacing people from their land. I know like is a little different as far as like a timeline in the colonial process, and you know, obviously different contexts they play out differently, but it looks similar because it is like, yeah, capitalism is built off of displacing people from their land, disconnecting them from everything that sustains them from that land and forcing them to work in a factory of some kind.
Right. It's kind of like the enclosure of the commons where, you know, prior to the advent of like industrialization, you had many people that were perfectly content to just work their own lands for subsistence. They had no, like, I don't want to go work in your fucking factory. I have a farm. My family eats off the farm. I work half the year. You know what I mean? Like whatever, like, why would I go work in your huddled factory and lose my fingers and stuff like that? It's like, well, now someone else owns your land, a lord owns your land, and now you can't rely on it for subsistence anymore. So now you're effectively wrenched into the process of selling your labor for a wage.
Right.
And
it's the
go ahead, John. No, go ahead.
It's kind of like that, like inevitable, like kind of ratchet effect, sort of, right? Hear me out, right? Whether we're talking about like, you know, the newly freed post Japanese imperial like Korean people that just kind of like form their own like sort of workers councils, or we're talking about like these people of the Soteo, or we're talking about the people of Palestine, or we're even talking about like, you know, the formerly enslaved people after the American Civil War. People kind of have a way of like, all right, we'll adapt to this, right? Or even the closure, like, you know, of the commons. Prior to that, like even as serfs, it's like, all right, we have our common land. We'll figure out a way to kind of like come together and figure out some way of organizing ourselves as people to be able to make this work, right? And it's almost as if like, you know, this moneyed class or some other class that, you know, is above them, right, just has to destroy that, has to dismantle that, and create a sense of like cultural or like social amnesia, or is like trying to instigate like a sort of phase of like social or societal amnesia, and reorganize the way that like people are, so that they don't work together, so that they're at each other's throats, or so that like, you know, that way of kind of just making things work, right, is no longer the process, so that they can be exploited even further.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I was going to say real quick too is that the economic logic of the elites at the time that he just described in the last passage that we read, also replicates the economic logic of the landlords in Europe, where like they were moving away from like this broad-based subsistence or grain agriculture to animal husbandry, which required less hands on the land. So we don't need these people here. Go, and you know, that was the process of kicking them off into the city. And a
like
similar kind of thing that they were talking about here is like, well, we're moving away kind of from growing these grain crops and stuff. We want to grow cattle because that's better for our economic situation. But what are we going to do with all these people? Well, we can send them to the Amazon, or which means they're not going to be here, and we can't exploit their labor in the city. But if we send them in the city, you know, they might start to hear about the Paris Commune and organize and rebel against us.
Can't have too many of them.
I hate to say this, and Philbo, but like I just have to take like a little bit of an issue of like, oh, they might hear about the Paris Commune. Slaves don't have to hear about the Paris Commune to revolt. You know what I mean? Like it's like, no, totally. I'm just saying, because it's like, you know, in the counter revolution of 1776, we have like, I think in Barbados we have the Stono Rebellion, we have Nat Turner and things like that. It's like there is just like an innate kind of like, hey, why don't we just
sucks?
There's like totally.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that to be like you're wrong, but I just kind of wanted to put that context out. That like, you know, we don't want to be super like, you know, I don't want it to come off Eurocentric. That it's
no, totally. You know, I guess what I mean more is like there is that in the air, and that there's these broader social forces that like are playing out in that like very famous example of the Paris Commune that I think is like is fanning out across the world, I think. And for me, that's like what's really fascinating about this understanding of history is like kind of, and what I've always tried to do as like a person in my understanding is like pinpoint all these different similar points around the world. And like, it's obviously in the minds of the elite that they're like, oh shit, all this is going down. What if they do that to us here?
Right. Yeah, no, and you're 100%
less of a cover, more of a vibe.
Yeah, I'm not trying to say that you're really incorrect in anything you're saying, but like the only reason I'm pointing it out is because that same exact process was playing out 100 years earlier after the Haitian slave revolution. Totally. You know what I mean? Like that same kind of like pearl clutching, like, oh my God, what if our slaves come into our house at night and kill us? You know what I mean? Like that had already been going on for a century, kind of like, especially on this side of the world where there was uprisings in Jamaica and Barbados and various colonies in the United States. So, you know, absolutely, that was in the air. I'm not trying to deny it wasn't, but I also just want to point out that, like, you know what I mean? Like there is also like independent, you know, uprisings against those conditions. Yeah,
domestic situations that are also just as poignant.
Exactly. Yeah. So now we're going to move into the next little portion of this. It's called the Exodus to the Coast. Philbo, can you bring up text number 5, please? Oh, wait. Hold on. Bring up text 4. I'm sorry. I didn't realize. I'm trying to make sense of everything I got here. Text number 4. This is it, right?
I think so. It should be.
I think this is it, right? Yeah. Okay, so I think this one is me. So, frightened by the strange army of ghost-like Sertanejos, the liberal opposition in Sierra reluctantly agreed to support a conservative plan to ship the Retirantes at imperial expense to the provinces of Amazonas and Para. Others were sent off to Recife, where they were loaded together with slaves on packets for transshipment to Rio and the labor-hungry southeast. Large landowners, however, expressed misgivings about such a massive exodus of workers, and Costa Pinto in Rio dragged his feet in remitting the promised subsidies. Grasping at an alternative policy to control an invasion that would eventually swell Fortaleza's population from 25,000 to 130,000. So think about that. This is a city, Fortaleza, it's actually a pretty large city in Brazil, 25,000 to 130,000. That is
a wide margin of error.
that's like 5 times population swell. President Estelita ordered rough shelters constructed for the hordes, investing the city and a dole of both money and food allotted to those unable to work. Costa Pinto and his conservative allies in Fortaleza, however, denounced this as a waste of money. Estelita, as a result, was replaced by a new, more conservative appointee, João Aguiar, who promptly discontinued the dole in public works. With Costa Pinto's support, he returned instead to the strategy of deporting the Sertanejos to the rainforests. Although thousands were debarked, usually in overcrowded and squalid conditions, there was not enough coastal shipping to keep up with the influx of refugees into Fortaleza and Recife. Meanwhile, on the rim of the Sertão, a human dam was about to burst. So like this kind of like lends us a little bit of like this is the scale of the refugee crisis that we're dealing with. To take what is already probably one of the larger cities in Brazil and multiply its population by 5 times of starving peasants. So it's like now you have this kind of like, the conundrum of the bourgeois that we discussed in the last paragraph is becoming intensified, right? So they're trying to build these like shanty refugee camps outside of the city so that they don't have to take in so many of them. They're trying to pack them up with slaves and send them to these other areas that need labor. Then like one like progressive guy is like, I say we give them food and shelter. He's axed immediately. He's like, you're out, bring in somebody else.
No.
Yeah, exactly. So then,
like
I don't think you understood the assignment.
Yeah. Exactly. So, you know what I mean? Like he's out immediately. They bring in somebody else that's like, yep, no food, no shelter, send them to work camps. So that's kind of like the precipice that we're on at this point. Well, and like we're still like not even like at the climax of the drought and famine yet.
Yeah.
That's still to come.
We haven't even reached that scene in World War Z in Palestine, the wall scene. You know what I'm talking about.
Right, exactly. So Philbo, if you want to go to text number 5 now, I think the next one is a text block. Yes. Okay, Johnny, you want to take this one for us?
By New Year's Day, 1878, perhaps 50,000 had died in Sierra, several tens of thousands more in other provinces of the Northeast. Farmers scattered some of the seeds they had carefully guarded through months of hunger, but the skies cleared, and the first planting shriveled. Scribner's, which by the way sounds made up, Scribner's correspondent Smith sounds even more made up, who arrived at the end of the year, interviewed scores of survivors about what happened next. They all like collectively came like ants over a wall. 1st of March and no rains. Government aid almost withdrawn. No food left in the villages. No hope for the starving peasants. Then, as by one impulse, a wild panic caught them. 400,000. They deserted their Sertão and rushed down to the coast. Oh, it was terrible. That mad flight. Over all the roads there came streams of fugitives, men and women and little children, naked, lean, famine-weak, dragging wearily across the plains, staining the Rocky Mountain paths with their bleeding feet, begging, praying at every house for a morsel of food. They were famished when they started, 2, 3, 4 days at times. They held their way. Then the children lagged behind in weakness, calling vainly to their panic-wild fathers. Then men and women sank and died on the stones. I have talked with men who came from the interior with great exodus. They tell stories of suffering to wring one's heart. They tell of skeleton corpses unburied by the roadside. For 100,000 dead, some say 150,000 were left by the way. So, like so many stories of the 20th and 21st century of just scores of people, right, seemingly fleeing from something, right? so many die like by the roadside. I would struggle to find a number, right? Because I'm not good at math. How many like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people throughout like the 20th century die like basically next to a road during like a period of like such great, technological development, right? This is the technological development, allegedly meant to feed everybody, allegedly meant to like, end this kind of like catastrophe that like has claimed so many people and is going to claim so many more before we're done with this book.
Right. And when we get to the last chapter, there's actually some interesting studies that we're going to talk about the relationship to technology with famine. So we can move on. What's image number 5? This should be, okay. Yeah, this is a boy that was photographed during this time, and he's distended stomach and pretty much, all bones visible. His knees are, I've never seen such pronounced knees. It's quite disturbing and haunting image of a very, very, very emaciated young boy.
Sadly and disturbingly, I have from like, images coming out of Palestine, you know?
Mm-hmm. It's reminiscent for sure. So a couple things that I want to point out here before we move on to the next texting is that now as the migrants are coming into the provincial, the population centers, they quickly become overwhelmed almost immediately. So in the epicenter in the state of Sierra, almost total social collapse had occurred by the spring of 1878. The quote states, "The treasury was empty, commerce was non-existent, and over 100,000 refugees clogged the towns on and near the coast. Outlaw bands roamed the backlands, threatening to displace completely the fragmented civil authority." So because of the drought, because of the famine, and then because of this massive refugee crisis of desperate, starving people, things are just maxed out. Everything's pretty much just going haywire at this point. A priest stated, "It's horrible to see that the despair of hunger has led the indigent population to eat cows that have died of carbuncle, knowing and saying that they will soon die from eating them, and eating horses, dogs, cane already chewed by others, pieces of leather, and anything else they can find. It is horror upon horror." So this kind of reminds me of when you're out on a raft and you start drinking the salt water. You know what I mean? You're just so fucking desperate. And you probably know somewhere in your mind that you're this salt is going to dehydrate me further, but you just can't resist that there's water out there. So you just have to start drinking it. It's you know what I mean? That's what these people are essentially doing.
Yeah. Which do I drink first, my own piss or the salt water?
Exactly. Because you're just maddened by desperation at that point.
Right. Thirst,
hunger, desperation. Even if you know in your mind that that's not a good idea, sometimes it's probably just so irresistible when you get to that level of desperation. Smith, the correspondent from Scribner magazine, also stated that he was told by a shop owner refugees came in asking permission to kill the rats in his store so that they might eat them. Horrifying rumors of cannibalism were relayed as far as Rio by migrants. So that means all the way down to Rio de Janeiro, there was instances of cannibalism occurring as a result of the desperation. Some of the starving mobs looted markets, and then the middle classes began locking themselves in their large houses out of fear of, these, roving.
Naturally. Exactly.
Yeah. What else do we have here? Okay. Liberals of Brazil at this time extolled the example of the Lytton administration in India and proposed to restore order in Sierra with strictly, this is quoted, scientific British methods.
Sounds fake and made up. Sounds dumb.
Well, they're referring to the scientific methods that the Britain used in India, which scientifically killed millions of people.
Scientifically.
Yeah. Their approach, as Cuniff points out, and Cuniff is a historian that we've been quoting throughout here a lot, their approach had been eloquently outlined by the famous engineer and liberal ideologue Andre Rebocus the previous October during a 3-day debate at the Polytechnic Institute in Rio. So he says, although he insisted that the government had a constitutional obligation to render relief to every citizen, he agreed that the rising sentiment that it should not be in the form of a dole, meaning just giving them money or giving them food.
So a Brazilian Britaboo was like, no, guys, we can't just give them a dole and feed them. All right, it's going to make it worse.
Welfare queens? seriously. Guys, we can't be doing this.
Yeah, he said there was a lamentable Latin tendency to confuse relief with charity. Citing the immortal Richard Cobden, he urged salaried employment on public works as the most efficient and morally appropriate remedy. He was
that salary low as you can go.
Yeah,
he
was guided by the example of the British government's handling of the severe drought in India. So effectively, if you remember in India, they were like, we can't give them any food. What we have to do is put them to work. They're going to build roads, dams, irrigation systems. And this turned out to be like almost like, you know, if you understand the psychology of like Nazi extermination camps, more times than not. Oh, no. Well, not more times than not. I think some people maybe misunderstand the Nazi concentration camps, that you just brought people in, gassed them, you know, burned them in ovens. And that's not necessarily what happened. They would keep them there for as long as possible and work them to death. And then the moment that they were either injured or too sick to work, then they would be executed in gas chambers. So it's like either intentionally or in practice, these types of like public works initiatives to save starving people effectively become these kind of like work death camps, much like the Nazis had in Poland.
Well, and I think that is obviously horrific, but I think on a mundane economic level, like they're doing this because, like, one, if we give out too much money, it's going to affect the price of grain. We can't like stop producing cotton because we're making so much money off of all this cotton that we're making, you know, which is kind of where we started at the beginning of the last episode, which is talking about like that disparity in the cotton and the changes in the global cotton economy at this time. And so like, yeah, like it's all of this is done in service of like maintaining the liberal idea of a market, of being the thing that's like the most important organizing feature of our society. I think that's an important thing to highlight, you know, as we 100%. Move through this discussion, is like that is kind of the underlying ideological logic of like, why can't we, you know, why is it bad to send relief to people? This is not only is there like these moral discussions that they bring into it of like, oh, it's going to make weak people, the Malthusian argument, but it's like we also have to maintain the profits of our commodity farms.
I don't even know how much they actually believed the Malthusian thing. I think the Malthusian thing was like an ethical and philosophical undergirding that would that means that you don't have to give up any of your profits just because people are starving in Ireland.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right about that.
You know, and so like maybe they internalized it after a point, but I really think that it's more like, I don't care that there's people starving in Ireland. I have a grain business that I'm tending to, and
I have all this money to count.
Yeah, what am I going to give it to them?
I've got to grow this pool of capital.
Exactly. So I think it's like a mixture of two, you know what I mean? And then like much like, you know, they worked upon one another to reinforce you know, the grim circumstance.
Right. Because they also have like these weird narratives of like, oh, well, it's just because they're lazy, or it's just because like they're addicted to opium, or,
but
you know, whatever.
It's very convenient that the thing that is most helpful to them, which is apparently letting them die, is also the most profitable for you.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that's kind of like the convenient, situation that they've constructed.
You know, God works in mysterious ways.
Counting money. You know what I mean? They're just counting money, and they're like, hey, you know.
So God's plan.
Yeah.
God's plan.
He wants me to have this.
Yeah. Philbo, if you can bring up the text number 6. Now, who read the last one? Was it Johnny? Is this one you, Philbo?
Yeah, this one's mine.
Okay, go ahead.
Motivated primarily by fears of revolution and epidemic, the new liberal president Serra Jose de Albuquerque
I didn't even realize that when I read it at first, but go ahead.
Stepped up the shipments of labor power to the Amazonas and Para, in some cases allowing local elites to forcibly deport retirantes, consciously following the example of the British government in India. He ordered local relief committees to begin projects suitable to unskilled labor and give relief only in exchange for labor. In Fortaleza. Sorry, my dyslexia is acting up.
This is actually, I know Fortaleza because of jiu-jitsu. So yeah, Fortaleza.
In Fortaleza, tens of thousands of retirantes were located to makeshift work camps outside the city, where they toiled in construction gangs of 100. Elsewhere in the Pernambuco was, sorry, y'all, as well as Seca, Sierra.
I call it Sierra. I think it might mean mountain. I think it might be kind of like
I think you're right.
Portuguese and Spanish are somewhat similar.
I think you're right.
Like Sierra. And
Sierra.
Yeah.
As well as Sierra, the oh my God, you're giving Johnny a hard time. It is me. The Sertanejos. Oh my God, I'm such a fucking gringo, and I live close to. It's Portuguese, so whatever.
It's a different language, man. You're fine. You're fine.
Oh my God, this is not helpful. The Sertanejos provided labor armies for the railroads, most of them never completed, that the liberals hoped to build with imperial support. Although the ration in the camps, 1/2 kilogram of meat, 1 liter of manioc flour, and 1 liter of vegetable daily, was a banquet compared to the temple wage. The living conditions were fully as deplorable as in the Deccan. The refugees, reported Smith, were huddled together about Fortaleza. Oh my God. And Aracati.
I don't know.
Barely sheltered from the sun in huts of boughs or palm leaves. The camps were filthy to the last degree. No attempt was made to enforce sanitary rules.
So again, this is kind of like what I was getting at before, of like having these kind of like public works initiatives, which might sound like, helpful in one sense. Like, okay, there's a bunch of people starving. We have to build this road. Let's get a bunch from there. We'll give them money and then they can eat. They don't have to be so desolate. But like really what this is it's almost kind of reminds me of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine about disaster capitalism. It's like, okay, well, there's a disaster. How can I profit from this disaster? I'm going to take the immiserated population. I'm going to put them to work instead of giving them any kind of like money. And the work, I'm really not going to be too concerned about actually helping them or actually giving them much relief. It's actually going to be like squalid conditions, overworked, famished people. I said infamished again. Do you remember that from the first episode? Famished people who are going to die in mass because of this labor exploitation I'm putting them through.
Right. As well as supplanting like any kind of like domestic ability to prevent this from continuing to happen.
Right. So if you want to go to image number 6, this is actually going to show this. I actually found a photo of what it was like. And this is like what one of those work camps was looking like.
That is a sea of people.
Right. Yeah.
I'm also noticing that it is a sea of melanated faces.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to me that this wasn't really brought up by Davis in there, but like it made me think it's like was this like the indigenous population in there in the Northeast? You know what I mean? Because like it sounds very much like he's referring to like white like settler or like settler descendant settler populations in these more like urban centers of like Portuguese people, and now there's what appears to be from these pictures, the more indigenous groups of like the Northeast.
Or then remember, right?
They could be black too. They could be black.
Afro-Brazilians are actually the majority of Brazilians.
Yeah, but they made a distinction to say that these weren't the slaves. That when they got there were slaves in the town centers that they could potentially join forces with. So like, I'm not sure how many, if
also, we don't know, like, I don't know that much about like Brazilian history in terms of like their distinction between like, an enslaved Afro-Brazilian, or was there a population of like semi-free or like because of mixed heritage, like, somewhat free, because like I know that like the Spanish had their own sort of like racialized caste system. I don't know what the Portuguese like kind of like racialized caste system was in Brazil, if there was one, you know what I mean?
The only reason that I'm leaning towards that this would be an indigenous group is that they're kind of like referred to as people that were like living on their own like kind of land, as opposed to like working on some kind of a plantation. It seemed like they weren't owned or living on owned property. It seemed like they were kind of like in a subsistence situation, while like maybe like a peasant type of situation, and then because of this drought, now they're coming in to contact with like slave populations on ranches and things like that. So, and also we're going to get to it, but apparently that this actually had a detrimental effect on the slave industry, because in Brazil, because there was so much exploitable labor from this area, that it actually kind of extinguished the slave industry. We'll read about that in a moment. So looking at this image here, it is noted in the book that these squalid work camps provided virgin soil for smallpox. This has been just like a pattern of all of this. When people are starving, when their immune systems are degraded, and then you shove them into these like work camps, labor initiatives, and things like that. Things like smallpox or cholera are just ascendant within these populations.
Yeah, it's just like Philbo brought up in the last episode about like that like kind of immune system that like, you know, a society is able to kind of build up.
Yeah, we're talking about literal immune systems at this point. Yeah.
Figurative immune system.
But I'm talking about the literal ones, like people that are starving.
I know.
The reason starving people, the reason starving people get like epidemics of cholera and smallpox is because their immune system is so compromised.
Yeah. And it's obviously compounded by the sanitary situation, like they mentioned in the reading. It's like, you know, it's just like a nightmare situation, you know.
Yeah. Okay. So then another thing in reference to the smallpox, this is from Smith. The greatest horror of the drought was smallpox. It had reached Sierra in the middle of 1878 after having ravaged the Caribbean capital of Joao Pessoa. Smith estimated that 1/3 of the population of Fortaleza died in the months of November and December 1878 alone, while Albuquerque testified that 100,000 had perished in Sierra by the end of 1879. This drought did not actually end until the beginning of March 1880. During this time, 80% of the herds were destroyed, meaning the cattle that a lot of these people relied upon for their subsistence. In 1881, it estimated that 90% of the inhabitants left the municipio during the drought, and 50% of those had not returned by August 1881. That was 2 full winter seasons after it ended. So this like thoroughly like decimated the population and whatever like culture / economy of, you know, this province. The Great Drought, it is said to have cast a long shadow, meaning that this extended deep into the history of this region of Brazil. Philbo, do you want to bring up text number 7? I think this is when they bring up some of the slave stuff. So indeed, Gilbert Freire explains the apocalyptic double sevens, meaning 1877, became the dramatic synthesis in Brazilian memory of the conjoined tragedies of drought and underdevelopment. Yet some sectors of the Nordeste's ruling class discovered that the drought industry was more profitable than the declining regional staples of sugar and cotton. This was certainly true in Singlehurst, Brocklehurst and Company, the British merchant house in Fortaleza, which supplied vast quantities of provisions to the government and transported thousands of restaurantes to the Amazon on their coastal steamers. Likewise, big sugar planters profiteered from lucrative imperial grants for temporarily putting drought refugees to work. A precedent was thus set for allowing the corones, which are the landowners who dominated provincial and local politics in the Nordeste, to plunder disaster aid. Development became simply a euphemism for subsidizing a reactionary social order, and over the next century, vast sums of drought relief disappeared into the Sortejo without leaving behind a single irrigation ditch or usable reservoir for its long-suffering population.
Imagine a company like Singlehurst and Brocklehurst and Company being responsible for like literally killing your entire family through like basically like starving you guys to death.
Well, this is kind of like reminding me of, again, like the disaster capitalism thing is like when a disaster happens, you know, the capitalist mindset would be to like, how do I profit from this disaster? So you have all these like, you know, sugar merchants and companies that are doing shipping and stuff like that. Like, oh, this is great. We're sending millions of or hundreds of thousands of refugees into the Amazon. We're getting sugar grants for relief, but we're actually embezzling essentially all of it. We're getting money for relief works to build irrigation ditches. They're not getting built. You know what I mean? Like it's all just, you know, turning what is an absolute fucking disaster and horror of humankind into a commodity, you know, commodifying the relief at that point.
I was just getting at how silly their names are, because it's like, imagine like Willy Wonka, like starving your family to death. Like,
Philbo, we have one more text here. Maybe this is the one that refers to the slave dynamic. Johnny, do you want to take this one?
Sure. The double sevens, however, did spell the beginning of the end to slavery in Brazil. Land, cattle, and free labor in the Sortejo became almost valueless commodities during the drought, leaving slaves in keen demand by Paulista coffee planters as the major fungible asset. Hey, everybody that survived COVID, remember the word fungible, right? Remember when everything was fucking fungible all of a sudden? Remember that? That was fun, right? The major fungible asset of the fazenderos. Again, I am sorry if I am actually mispronouncing this word into a slur. Selling slaves to the South, like exporting free labor to the Amazon, generated obscene prosperity amid general catastrophe. The Baron Idipapa, Joaquin de Cun et Ferrier, for example. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. For example, profited greatly, being the principal exporter of human cargo from both Fortaleza and Masoro. From Fortaleza alone, he was reputed to have sold at least 15,000 slaves south. This sudden revival on a grand scale of the slave trade, with all the brutal public spectacles that accompanied it, provoked enormous public resentment, particularly in Sierra, where emancipation societies formed in virtually every town. Within 6 years, popular agitation had not only ended slavery in Sierra, the first province to do so, but sparked similar crusades across the Northeast. 4 years later, in the final twilight of the old empire, slavery was abolished throughout Brazil, and everything was better again. Everything was good. No problems ever happened ever again in Brazil. Everybody held hands and swayed and held their hands high and sang Kumbaya, or whatever the Brazilian version of Kumbaya is. I'm sure it's like with a lot of C's and consonants.
Wow.
So
Kumbaya.
This is like an interesting thing, that the Sierra was the first state in all of Brazil to abolish slavery. And it's like, you have this like windfall of exploitable labor coming down from these places. And like, this guy's like, all right, I'm going to sell all my slaves. Like, you know what I mean? Like, what the fuck?
Time to offload.
Yeah. What do I need slaves for at this point? And that apparently was a catalyst in the abolition movement in Brazil.
So it literally did not end for any moral reason. It only ended because it was no longer profitable.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
I wonder if that's a theme.
If Philbo, if you want to bring up the last picture, this is kind of like an interesting. This is actually painted in, I think, 1944. It's called "The Dead Child" by Tiago Bragantin, and this is a artistic rendition of the famine. It's called "The Dead Child."
This is actually powerful painting.
Yeah. There's actually three paintings by this that are all attributed to this. I only included the one, but there's actually three different ones that this artist had painted to depict the. It's called the Grande Seca. Grande Seca, I believe, is the name of the actual famine. Yeah, Grande Seca. It's known as the Grande Seca, or the Great Drought, or the Brazilian Drought of 1877 to 1878. It was the largest and most devastating drought in Brazilian history.
Yeah, no, this is actually like a really like moving painting, and
It makes sense that you said it was done later. It wasn't like a contemporary piece too. When you said the time, it was like, oh yeah, no, it definitely fits in with like the whole 1940s kind of, global painting scene. Mm-hmm.
It kind of reminds you of Picasso's painting of the Korean massacre. He has a massacre in Korea about the No-Gun-Ri massacre that was conducted by the United States against fleeing civilians in South Korea. South Korean fleeing, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We don't need to get into. We don't need to open the can of worms.
We don't need to start Korea maxing while we're in the middle of Brazil maxing.
Well, we're actually done Brazil maxing. We're actually going to move next to the next chapter here, which is a much shorter chapter than the other ones that we did. So we're going to include it here. It's called Chapter 3, Gunboats and Messiahs. It's less than 30 pages. I think it's about 25 pages. And in this chapter, Mike Davis essentially speed runs a number of other drought-related issues, maybe not all of them rising to the scale of mass famine like we talked about here in China and India and Brazil, but they are worth noting. So, Philbo, if you want to go to text number 1, and I think it's your turn to read.
India, China, and Brazil accounted for the most massive mortality, but the world drought of the 1870s had profound and deadly impacts in at least a dozen other lands. Peasant producers, as we have seen, were already reeling from the impact of the trade depression, which deepened abruptly in 1877. Drought and famine gave foreign creditors allied with indigenous moneylenders and compradors new opportunities to tighten control over local rural economies through debt and outright expropriation. Pauperized countrysides likewise provided rich harvests of cheap plantation labor, as well as missionary converts and orphans to be raised in the faith. And where native states retained their independence, the widespread subsistence crises in Asia and Africa invited a new wave of colonial expansion that was resisted in many cases by indigenous millenarianism. El Nino was thus followed by gunboats and messiahs, as well as famine and disease.
So essentially what this chapter is going to be about is, the way in which, as El Nino, causes these droughts and things like that, that it is capitalized upon. You know what I mean? Like that imperial powers uses as a way that they can tighten control, tighten influence, and, either through like imperial methods or through like, missionary, like ecclesiastical methods. So it's like, that's why it's called gunboats and messiahs. So simply because Mike Davis kind of speed run to this, I'm going to speed run it as well. Like, I'm not going to go into too excruciating detail because we'll be here all night. So I kind of have like the spark notes of like several of these. We'll get a little bit more in depth on some of them. But the first one that he mentions is Korea. So this is interesting because in the Korean case, the opportunistic colonial power was Japan. If you know about Korean history, it is around 1880 that the Japanese inflict this like really unfair treaty. It allows like extra territorial control of Japan. It's effectively what allowed like the overall colonization of Korea by Japan. In a familiar pattern, the drought in North China extended latitudinally across the Yellow Sea into Korea's bedbasket, the Cholla region. The ensuing famine and peasant unrest coincided with the implementation of the Open Door Treaty that Meiji Japan had extorted from Korea in 1876 and offered the Japanese a pretext for further prying open of the Hermit Kingdom for economic exploitation. Within 1 decade, the commercial export of rice from South Korea to Japan during a drought would become a revolutionary grievance among hungry peasants in the Cholla provinces. So just like all these other ones, really like, if you heard about like Korea being exploited as the breadbasket for Japan because Japan didn't create enough rice, so they had to exploit the rice. Like 1/3 of all rice was taken from Korea into Japan, as well as like, millions of their citizens as slaves, either working in mines or factories or as sex slaves. We obviously this will all come to a fore during World War II. But according to Mike Davis, largely the impetus for that can be attributed to the drought conditions of the El Nino of the El Nino droughts.
Wild.
Then also in Vietnam, there was a coincidence of drought, famine, and cholera. And that actually fanned the embers of peasant anti-colonial resistance. The time had come to expel the French, widely believed to be responsible for this conjugation of disasters. Peasants armed with bamboo spears and amulets attacked French garrisons. However, they were driven back decisively by rifle fire. But you can say that the drought and the hunger that caused it caused an anti-colonial uprising in French Indochina at the time. Obviously, they were not successful at that time, but it's just worth noting that this kind of like social unrest there was a catalyst to it, and that catalyst was the drought.
Wait, before we move on from the Vietnam one, is that the one that I'm thinking of where like the dude is like the French didn't count on him being reincarnated, and it's like the Simpsons meme where Moe is throwing out Barney and like Barney pops up directly behind him?
There's a lot of stuff in here that I kind of didn't really include, and it's more of like the what's the word that I'm looking for, like mythologized kind of stuff.
To me, it was a fun detail, Pat.
It is fun. I'm just saying I didn't include it.
He got reincarnated and came back, and everyone was like, yes, he did. All right, he's back.
Then we go to the Dutch East Indies. In the Dutch East Indies, meanwhile, drought ravaged fields and forests across 2/3 of the vast archipelago. Batavia, which would become Jakarta, for example, reported less than 1/3 of its normal rainfall from May 1877 through February 1878. And as in the 1990s, El Nino was synonymous with vast, mysterious forest fires. What's so mysterious? What's so mysterious about forest fires in a drought?
Yeah, I don't. It seems pretty self-explanatory to me. Like, especially
like
now,
a gender
when we,
reveal.
Yeah, exactly. It was caused by a gender reveal party. But I mean, when you just think about the Outback burning, I think it came. I guess it's two or 3 years ago now. Like, it's pretty. It's not that mysterious, I guess. Is the
I believe that also happened because of a gender reveal.
If I'm not mistaken,
actually might have, yeah.
If I'm not mistaken. So then in Borneo / Kalimantan, which are also Dutch East Indies territories, if I understand correctly, according to Han Knappen, the drought was a godsend to the Dutch, long frustrated by their inability to subordinate the ruggedly independent Dayak communities that controlled vast tracts of valuable rainforests. So this is another instance of like an imperial power being like, wringing their hands together at the drought. Like it's like, oh, finally, those uppity indigenous people will no longer be able to resist us now that there's a drought happening there. So capitalizing on that to exert further imperial control. There's another part of this too. So they had a cultivation system, and I don't speak Dutch, but it's Kulturstelsel. I don't know. I don't speak Dutch. It looks like it's
Kulturstelsel.
Yeah. The pressure of that so-called cultivation system, which compelled villages to cultivate export crops for the benefit of the Netherlands at the expense of their own subsistence, was higher here as measured by the proportion of acreage committed to exports than anywhere else in Java. So again, this is much like in Ireland and India. While we see massive, famine occurring, we are, exporting massive amounts of grain to like the mother country as opposed to like feeding the starving people. And then it goes on to say that the Kulturstelsel has been crucial to the Netherlands' great economic revival in the earlier Victorian period. Remittances forcibly extracted from the Javanese peasantry had at one point provided fully 1/3 of state revenues. That's just from Java.
That's just so wild. And I think like what's so interesting is like, to me, about a lot of this stuff is like a lot of these independence movements really didn't reach their peak and become successful post World War II. And so it's like, kind of hearkening back to the title of the book, it's like the same kind, not just, obviously Nazi Germany is an extreme example of a very horrific situation, but it's like when you start to put it in the context of like the lineage of the liberal history of the 1800s and the leading up into the 1900s, which then you get into World War I, and then obviously leading into World War II, it's like it's not so different, which I think is scary for a lot of people, that it's like the tradition of Nazi Germany very much has roots in like liberal capitalism.
Right. And that like there's not much different going on here. Like how many times has Pat needed to say that like, this was a caloric deficit that was imposed on these people that was even less than what was given to victims of the Shoah, right? Like, the other thing is that, like, I think that everyone thinks that maybe, like, some people know that World War I was pretty bad, and then things calm down and everything was fine until suddenly, like, Hitler comes along and World War II happens and then everything's better again, right? And it's just not the case. And that, like, most of the 1800s is just punishing these countries in the global South with like hundreds of thousands, if not like millions of deaths of people like just purposefully being starved to death. Sure, there's like whatever excuse that they came up with, like, to kind of like make it right in their heads, right? Or like, whatever financial reason, but that is a monstrous reason to starve people for profit, right? Like we recognize that, right? We recognize that then. There were obviously people throughout this book, even within these countries, right, that are benefiting from starving these people that are like, this is horrific. This is horrifying. This is monstrous. We need to stop this.
Sorry, I'm pulling something up real quick. One moment, because I have a quote that here it is. So this is a quote that this might be the next book that we do. I don't know. We'll see. But it's called The Kaiser's Holocaust, and it's about a genocide that occurred in Namibia or German Southwest Africa. This is prior to the Nazis. This is prior to Hitler really having any kind of meaningful control. And I think this is one of the best quotes for contextualizing what the Nazis truly were. And then the authors of this book say, this is the great post-war myth, the comforting fantasy that the Nazis were a new order of monsters and that their crimes were without precursor or precedent. They were not. Much of Nazi ideology and many of the crimes committed in its name were part of a longer trend in European history. Nazism was both a culmination and a distortion of decades of German and European history and philosophy. It was, in part, the final homecoming of theories and practices that Europeans had developed and perfected in far-flung corners of the world during the last phase of imperial conquest.
Right.
Yeah. I think, and another kind of example that relates back to the book that we're currently covering is, where they're talking about the progressives of the time were like, we need to have these people in works programs because we can't just give them food or whatever. Like they need to be doing, relief is this specific thing. Yeah.
And just to kind of talk about that, when you look, if you go to Thomas Robert Malthus's Wikipedia page, I don't think many people in a current conceptualization of liberalism view him as a liberal. If you go to his Wikipedia page, have you ever noticed
the grandfather of liberalism?
Have you ever noticed that if you go to somebody's Wikipedia page and on the side it'll be like, this is part of this collection, right?
Yeah.
Thomas Robert Malthus is this article is part of a series on liberalism in the United Kingdom. And then there's a second one, part of a series on liberalism. So it's even on his, Wikipedia page, you don't have to go into some esoteric tome of tanky literature to find that kind of what I mean? That depiction of these people.
Yeah.
I now want to make that a thing. This is the esoteric tome of tanky literature. This is a compilation of
I like it. That's the Verse of History merch right there.
Yeah. So moving on, Philippines. This one is really interesting, actually, because this island of the Philippines, it's okay. So I don't mean to be insensitive here, but it's called Negros. The island is called Negros. It's still called Negros to this day. I don't know if you know that. I did not know that there is a place called that. Yeah.
The Isle of Negros.
Well, I'll tell you why it's called that. In the Philippines, the great drought struck hardest in the western Visayas, especially the island of Negros, where the explosive growth of sugar monoculture had displaced traditional food self-sufficiency. Just as the Philippines has been often described as Latin American social formation in East Asia, likewise, the Occidental province of Negros, whose population skyrocketed from 18,000 in 1855 to 308,000 in 1898, came to replicate most of the exploitative and unsustainable characteristics of distant Caribbean sugar colonies. It's pretty interesting, right? That there's this island of the Philippines that is kind of like a duplicate or a replica of sugar plantations in.
I think it makes sense in a certain way if you think about it in just the colonial histories, the Spanish colony, and so they just how do we make money out of these things? Well, here's what we're doing over in in the New World. Okay, well, we have these places that are similar kind of climate. We could probably set up the similar kind of operation here, and honestly, the same kind of process still plays out now. Instead of it being sugar, it's now date palms, palm oils, palm oil, not date palms.
In addition to that, we also see this intercolonial exchange. So for example, the reason that you find Indian people in both South Africa and Guyana is because all three of those places were British colonial subjects. So when they required labor in one or the other, they would draw labor from India and have indentured servitude come from India to these other colonies. So now we see Indian populations that are of the, you know what I mean? So it's the same thing with Spain. You know what I mean? Spain had these two colonies on other sides of the world, but there's going to be a disbursement and an exchange of like the colonial identity of those places.
And that kind of goes into like what like Frantz Fanon wrote about, where like the supplanting, right, or replacement of like whatever indigenous culture is present with like the culture and society of like the colonizer and whatnot. But that's a whole other stream. Okay, that's a whole other book. One day.
I do also want to put out Michael Billig, who is a historian, I assume. The process was expedited by an extraordinary representative of free trade imperialism. This is referring to the Philippines. So in 1855, the Philippines was officially open to foreign commerce, and the next year, the British sent Vice Consul Nicholas Loney to the city. Loney was to be the single most potent force in bringing down the textile industry and building up the Negro's sugar industry. Aside from being Vice Consul, he was the commercial agent for British firms and an indefatigable purveyor of British goods. He pursued a local mission of substituting cheaper, machine-made British textiles for the locally made ones and encouraging the production of sugar as a profitable return cargo. The fledgling sugar industry, unlike older textile business, was thoroughly dependent on foreign capital. So like he essentially went in there and just sabotaged like the industry of the island, which would have been textiles, and just kind of like wrenched the entire thing to monoculture sugar production. Like coercively and intentionally to like for the purposes of exploitation. So we kind of ran through those ones quickly, but I do want to actually go through this one in a little bit more excruciating detail. And because I found this so interesting, like this is like one of those like trivias of history that like almost sound made up. Like it's almost like something out of a book. And it's funny because Philbo, you've brought up the Paris Commune 3, 4, 5 times in this so far. So
a dozen times.
This is like
a dozen times the Paris Commune.
Yeah,
everything comes back to the Paris fucking Commune.
He just won't shut the fuck up about the Paris Commune. Fine, Philbo. We'll talk about the Paris Commune. Philbo, can you please bring up text 2? And I think this is me to read, right? So
yeah.
The Canucks of New Caledonia also stirred to rebellion by El Nino drought and hunger, made a desperate bid in 1878 to liberate the interior of their island from French colons and penal concessionaires. The French invasion of New Caledonia in 1853 had been a singular catastrophe for Kanak society. In less than 2 years, writes Miriam Dorney, the local chiefly system was destroyed and the Melanesians were dispossessed of 9/10 of their best land and pushed into the mountainous interior. When the natives protested, the Republicans haughtily decreed that the native is not the owner of the land, and when the French government appropriates land, it just takes back its own land.
The native is not the owner of the land, and when the French government appropriates the land, it just takes back its own land, okay? All right, Kanak people?
Which, by the way... deed in French. I have the deed. It's in French, you see?
You may not be able to read French, but I can, and that's what matters.
It says you don't.
So, by the way, for anybody that doesn't know, because, like, you know, when I was reading this, I had no fucking idea where New Caledonia was. It's like a like kind of
give me
long.
A second, because maybe I have a map that's about to come up.
Right. Well, for the audio listener, right, it's like to the right and up of Australia.
Can you just bring a picture, Philbo, please? Can you just go to the next
we'll
slide?
just
next to the well-known islands of Vanuatu, right?
Yeah, it's right there. Yeah, to the east of Australia, kind of around the like Solomon Islands, Fiji, Vanuatu. But, you know, I thought that last slide was very important for a couple of reasons. One, you know, the indigenous people of New Caledonia was forced off of like what 9/10 of their land and like forced to like what was essentially like a reservation, like in like the mountainous corner of the island. And also it really just shows like the imperial hubris of France to be like, oh, what, you're mad because we took your land? It ain't even your land. It was always our land. You know what I mean? Like that's really this like
it was always our land.
That's really like the sentiment of like manifest destiny and Lebensraum and like a white man's burden style conception of like geopolitics and foreign expansion. Now where this gets real interesting. Oh no, actually, I'm going to read this real quick. Following the arrest of several traditional chiefs in June 1878, accumulated Kanak anger erupted in a succession of ferocious assaults on white homesteads and gendarme posts. Caught by complete surprise, 200 Europeans were killed and panic spread where the settler mouthpiece for La Nova Caledonia called for a war of extermination against all Melanesians, which are the indigenous people. With reinforcements from Indochina and Kanak mercenaries from coastal tribes, French colonist mobiles under the celebrated Captain Riveri devastated much of the central region, burning hundreds of villages, confiscating food stores, destroying irrigation systems, killing warriors on site, and handing over their women as booty to the pro-French tribes. So that's what the French did when there was an uprising. They pretty much just went scorched earth and just killed the indigenous people in mass. They also did utilize indigenous mercenaries from the coast, but that shouldn't be that surprising. This is kind of like there's collaborators in just about every colonial movement. So
right.
That's just something that happens. So Philbo, this is where it gets really interesting. And Johnny, would you want to read this one, or Philbo, do you want to take the honors of this one because it mentions one of your favorite things?
I'll take it, sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Among the eyewitnesses to the Cadec tragedy was a survivor of another defeated insurrection, Louis Michel, the Red Virgin of Paris. Although,
what?
I guess that's what they called him.
Or, it's her, by the way.
Her, sorry. That's what they called her. Although some communards in penal exile in New Caledonia joined the race war against the Kanaks, Michelle passionately supported the Kanak struggle for liberty and dignity. She translated some of the haunting war chants of the rebel bard Andia, and gave half of her famous red scarf, the red scarf of the commune that I had hidden from every search, to two native friends who had joined the insurgents. As she explained in her memoirs, the Kanakan insurrection of 1878 failed. The strength and longing of human hearts was shown once again, but the whites shot down the rebels as they were mowed down in front of Bastion. In front of Bastion. Is it 37 or is that a footnote? I think it's a footnote.
I think it's just it's just a footnote.
I don't know sometimes. You never know.
Yeah. No, I know.
And on the plains of Sattery, when they sent the head of Attai to Paris, I wondered who the real headhunters were. When Henry Rochefort had once written to me, the Versailles government could have given the natives lessons in cannibalism.
So I don't know. This is wild to me. Like that, like we're talking about all these like far flung corners of the world and these things. And it's like, so after the Paris Commune, the communards, the people that were engaged, a lot of them were slaughtered, but some of them were sent into penal exile. And one of these people, someone who was just in the Paris Commune, was now exiled to this fucking island off the coast of Australia, where she supported and recorded the events of this indigenous uprising. And like, there was a bunch of people that were exiled there who actually joined the race war on the side of the French, but she actually remained, steadfastly supportive of the indigenous people there. She's actually went on to be one of the most renowned anarchists and feminist writers of the 19th century. She's actually like very prolific. And one of my favorite things here is just, so when you got to that part, they sent the head of Attai to Paris. That was the leader of the insurrection. They cut his head off and they sent it to Paris. And actually, I'm pretty sure they still have it. Hold on one second. I wanted to add this address. I read it on Wikipedia. But however, one second, sorry. But I think the best thing is at the end there, do you see the quote? Like, you know what I mean? They're talking about the sending of the head back there and saying like, there's this kind of like gross stereotype of like,
actually, Pat, they returned it in 2014.
Okay,
good for them.
Hey guys,
10 years ago.
Our bad about that head that we confiscated from you. Here, you can have it. You can have it back now.
I know we took this body part as a trophy of war, but here you go.
Well, it's not even like it's a trophy of conquering your people. And
But there's a very poignant at the end of that. The Versailles government could give the natives lessons in cannibalism because there's this racist stereotype of native people or indigenous people that they engage in cannibalism and all this stuff, and it's like really it's the Versailles government that is sawing people's heads off and bringing it back in a crate so that it can be put on display.
So real quick, Ataï's head was preserved in alcohol and studied by European scientists for anthropological purposes. It was displayed in Paris's first anthropological museum, the Musée d'Ethnographie du Trocadero, which closed in 1935, and then at the Musée de l'Homme, also in Paris. It was later thought to have been stolen, but was rediscovered in 2011 and has since been at France's National Museum of Natural History.
So it's still in France?
Until like 2014. The article finishes with like,
and then France magnanimously gave it back.
Yes.
We're done with it.
They patted themselves.
We are sorry.
Whoops. And the other thing that I meant to bring up a minute ago when I was talking about like the progressive dole is like the work thing. Being the thing is all these same progressives were also like the eugenicists and very much like like we were talking about with all the stuff that led up culminated in, I think that quote really summed it up nicely, is like everything culminated kind of in the Nazi regime and how it viewed the world and treated human beings.
Dude, there's like pictures like of this man's like head.
I didn't
intact.
include that. I didn't actually come through those. I should have probably included one of those.
Then, maybe
might be pushing the boundaries of what we could put up onti YouTube. I don't know. It is educational, but we don't need to do that.
From myself. Maybe I saved myself from myself because if I would have found one of those, this is going in. So Philbo, if you want to just go to the next picture, I actually have a picture of Louise Michel. This is actually from her in New Caledonia. This sketch is actually of her on the island. I thought that was a pretty interesting like twist of history. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like this woman who was a communard that was like one of the leading voices in the Paris Commune uprising was then exiled to this like God, like people today don't even know that this place exists, let alone
I'm sorry, I didn't know.
Yeah, and then while she's there, she's like still just supporting indigenous uprisings and insurrections and talking shit about the French the whole time. Like she's
a real one.
Yeah, she's badass. So that concludes one portion of the chapter. Now there's just a little bit more that we're going to go through. The next subsection is called Drought and Imperial Design in Africa, where just as in these other places in Southern Africa, the Great Drought became the chief ally of Portuguese and British aggression against still independent African societies. A historian, Jill Diaz, states that the intensification of external trade pressures and colonial intervention in Angola from the 1870s onwards both influenced the growing severity of famine and disease and was influenced by it. So, again, just exploiting a nation while it's in a period of drought. They go on to say that the extension of the plantation system and the consolidation of the colonial power in the Angolan interior were carefully synchronized to the sinister rhythm of drought and disease, as in 1886 to 1887, 1890, 1891, 1898 to 1899, 1911, and 1916. So this is like an interesting thing, like, the consolidation of colonial power was carefully synchronized to the sinister rhythm of drought and disease. Like, it's almost like, the two go hand in hand. Like, you know what I mean? As you become immiserated from drought and disease, the wrench of colonial consolidation tightens itself another ratchet,
Yeah.
Philbo, do you want to bring up text 4? This is about South Africa. We're kind of going through this a little bit quickly, but that's kind of how it is in the book as well. There's only a couple paragraphs dedicated to each one. So Johnny, do you want to take this one since Philbo leapfrogged you for the commune one?
Sure. The drought crisis, which weakened both African and Afrikaan societies, as well as increasing the tensions between them, was an undisguised blessing to imperial planners in London. Since 1875, Disraeli and his colonial secretary, Lord Carnarvon, had been committed to a confederation scheme that envisioned a single British hegemony over the southern cone of Africa. Carnarvon's design, according to Kane and Hopkins, was to turn Central Africa and Mozambique into labor reserves for the mines and farms of the South. The discovery of the Great Kimberley Diamond Pipes had overnight made South Africa a major arena for capitalist investment, but the British were stymied by the lack of control over African labor, a problem that was considered insuperable as long as militarily independent African societies continued to exist on the periphery of the diamond fields. Thus, from his arrival in South Africa in March 1877, Carnarvon's Special High Commissioner Sir Bartle Frere, a former governor of Bombay, now called Mumbai, moved with extraordinary energy to impose British power on the drought-weakened Bantus and Boers alike.
So like this is Britain capitalizing on drought conditions to consolidate control in South Africa, both from the indigenous Bantu people and the settler population of Dutch Boers. Boers.
How can we make this situation work for us?
So then it goes into
send Bartleby.
Then it goes into talk about Egypt a little bit. The new imperialism was more successful in Egypt, where the full human impact of the poor Northeast African rains of autumn 1876 and the low Nile of 1877 was not felt at the beginning of 1878. Right. So the drought struck a peasantry already reeling from collapsing export prices, high indebtedness, a rinderpest epidemic, and overtaxation. Cotton prices, already depressed by the return of the American South to world trade, slumped further with world trade depression. If you remember, Egypt was one of the ones listed in that first cotton table that we went through. After 20 years of being an interest milk cow for European investors, the Khedive was forced to default in 1878. Surrendering control over revenues to a Franco-British dual control commission. Under extreme European pressure, regiments of tax collectors with moneylenders following them like a vulture after a cow imposed a reign of terror throughout the Nile Valley. Peasants who hid cattle or resisted the confiscation of their property were brutally flogged in front of their neighbors. So this is how France and Britain effectively, created further imperial control over Egypt. Let me just make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. So then later also in Algeria, fields and vineyards simply burned up in the terrible heat of 1877. Half of the grain harvest was lost and famine was reported from Oran in the west to Constantine in the east. There's a summary of this that states, in the most drought-stricken regions, the harvest was utterly lost. Elsewhere, it was poor at best. The loss of seed ensured a poor yield the following year as well. Meanwhile, the lack of water and grass threatened to decimate the native herds. The interior tribes were forced to sell their animals to livestock dealers at dirt cheap prices. Exports of sheep doubled, while wheat and barley exports fell by half. Likewise, Algeria, which had exported 17,000 head of beef in the 3 years from 1874 to 1876, exported 143,000 head between 1877 and 1878. In order to avoid starvation, Algerians liquidated their only real wealth, their livestock. So, think about that. From 1874 to 1876, Algeria exported 17,000 heads of cattle. In 1877, it was 143,000. So that's up by more than that's almost 100% increase. It's close to 100% increase of export. No, I don't mean 100%, 100 times. Sorry, 100% increase. It's almost 100 times increase. And it's because they were so economically immiserated that they all had to just sell their cattle, which is the only real wealth that they had. Philbo, if you want to bring up image number 3. Yeah, this is, if you look, this is the famine of Algeria is what it says on the bottom in French. I don't speak French, but I assume La Famine in Algeria is what's being referred to in these pictures here.
Seems like a safe assumption.
Thank you very much. Let's see here. Then it goes into Morocco. I think we have a text for Morocco here. If you want to go to text number 5, this one is now me, right? It comes back to me. However, Morocco's long ordeal by famine and disease, as Miege emphasizes, was not without winners. The crisis of 1878 to 1885 hastened the rise of the commercial and landed capitalism that dominated the future of the country. The non-specialization of commerce permitted strong houses to switch from exports to imports of food. In the ports, the famine created islands of prosperity. The tremendous redistribution of property likewise paved the way for famous comprador fortunes and allowed the foreign community to accumulate massive land holdings under fictive Moroccan ownership. It also inaugurated the era of great power rivalry conducted with both loans and dreadnoughts to turn Morocco's new economic dependence upon Europe into formal colonialism. So again, the famine and disease being leveraged by capitalist / colonial powers to exert further control. So now we're just going to go into this last section here, and this is kind of summarize this. The book is broken up into 3 parts. This is the end of part 1. So we're kind of going to just do a quick summary of everything, and then we'll be on our way for tonight. Philbo, if you want to bring in text number 6, and Johnny, do you want to read this one?
Sure. The full measure of this global tragedy, Nature in 1878 called it the most destructive drought the world has ever known, can only be guessed at. Writing to a Russian correspondent about the British bleeding of India, Marx, I assume Karl Marx, warned that, quote, the famine years are pressing each other and in dimensions till now not yet suspected in Europe. In India, where 5.5 million to 12 million died despite modern railroads and millions of tons of grain in commercial circulation, embittered nationalist writers compared the callous policies followed by Calcutta to those emanating from Dublin Castle in 1846. The chief difference, as Indian National Congress leader Ramesh Dutt later pointed out in his famous open letters to Lord Curzon, was that instead of the 1 million Irish dead of 1846 to 1849, quote, a population equal to the whole population of Ireland had disappeared under the desolating breath of the famine of 1877.
Yeah, not really much to add there. Just like, you know what I mean? That this is, one of the greatest, most destructive droughts the world has ever known.
I don't even think I've ever heard any Indian, like I'm half Desi. I've met plenty of Desi people. None of them ever talk about these things. None of them are even aware that they even happened half the time.
Yeah. Well, and Americans certainly aren't. I didn't learn about this until I read this book. I knew about the Irish famine for a long time, and I've heard about the Holodomor for a long time as well. But the things that happened in India are far less known, despite the entire population of Ireland effectively dying in the famine of 1877. We have other famines to talk about in India also. We're not done on that subcontinent.
We're just starting.
We're just starting. Yes. So if you want to go, there's an image number 4. So this here is the parameters of the 1876 to 1878 famine in India. So, you can look at each individual province, but really it doesn't matter quite as much as just looking down at the totals. The total of the affected population is 58.3 million. The average number receiving relief is only 1.3 million, and the total deaths is 7.1 million, according to this tabulation.
Wow.
Yeah. With only 1.3 million receiving any kind of aid.
And like the aid being the temple wages,
Yeah,
it's like
here's a tiny bowl of gruel.
Yeah.
And then you have to work all day.
Right, exactly.
Doing extremely hard manual labor.
Yeah.
It's not even like just paperwork or whatever.
Now make this road. I know you're starving to death. I know your knobby knees can barely support your own weight, but
buck up.
You need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We have to get more grain to market. We're taking it. That's why we're building this road. Don't you understand? Yes, it'll all trickle down.
Can't you think of the profits?
Think about the money we're making here.
My good man. Okay, can we go over to text number 7? And this one's you, right, Philbo?
Yeah.
Now, this one's interesting. We're talking because Johnny brought up technology, the technology that should have been used as life-saving.
Right.
Philbo, read this one out and keep that in mind.
The 1878 to 80 famine commission statistics revealed a surprisingly perverse relationship between modernization and mortality that challenged the British belief in life-saving railroads and markets. In both Bombay and Madras, Deccan, as Digby pointed out in Acerbic commentary, the population decreased more rapidly, 23%, where the districts were served by railways than where there were no railways, 21%. The protection against famine entirely in the wrong. This is a protection against famine in the entirely wrong direction. In a study of the Kurnool district, E. Rajeshkar came to a similar conclusion. The population loss, 1876 to 1878, in areas well served with transport, such as Patikonda, was high compared to irrigated areas such as Shrivel and Nandyal, where, though transport was ill-developed, a better employment opportunities improved entitlement to food.
So what this study is showing, that population decreased more rapidly where the districts were served by railways. Now, when it says more rapidly, we're only comparing 23% to 21%. But if we are to believe that railroads are these modernizing force that just, assists the fluidity of your civilization, they shouldn't even be comparable. They shouldn't even be equal, let alone less. You know what I mean? So like, even though it's only a 2% increase, it should be like drastically under if the railroad projects were as benevolent as we're to believe they were.
Well, and I think the other aspect of it is the technology of markets, which is something that I think we've talked about several times. Is like they're viewed in tandem, and like part of potentially what could have caused population decrease in the areas where there was a railroad is because it makes it easier to leave, but that has an impact on the whole social fabric that is collapsing in a situation like this, which is an important part. And then also we talked about how when people leave these areas due to disaster, that displacement, becoming a refugee in this situation, has impacts that are exacerbated when people move into another area, because it's not just like a single individual leaving, it's like massive groups of people leaving.
Right, exactly. So if you want to go to the next picture, actually there's a table that illustrates this a little bit. This is the demographic change in the Madras famine districts. You can see here that within a period of we're looking at like -20, -25, -17, the decreases in their population. And then even like, further in the future, they only, the Kurnool and Kadapa don't even reach positive. Like they haven't even replaced it. In Bellary, they did, but only marginally.
Not good.
Yeah, we can go to the next one now. Now we're going to talk about China. 1877 was China's driest year in 2 centuries, and official Chinese estimates of the death toll ranged as high as 20 million. Nearly a fifth of the estimated population of North China perished in this famine. So if you look here, this is 2 different things. Like there's the Rockhill numbers and the Harper numbers. So those are 2 different tabulations. And what we're looking here is these are the number of things that happen. When we talk about that century of humiliation, so it starts with the Taiping Rebellion, which between 20 and 40 million people died. Then you have the Muslim Rebellion, where 1 to 8 million people died. Then you have the famine, which we've covered here, where 9.5 to 13 million people died. Then you have Yellow River floods, just the next decade, 2 million. Another famine, which we'll probably discuss later in this book, where 1 million people died. And then another Muslim rebellion late in the 19th century, where 250,000 people died. That's a total of between 33.7 million and 61 million in a period of 50 years. Less than 50 years. And with the Taiping Rebellion being the single most lethal situation that occurred in China during this period, but followed second by the famine that we discussed in detail. China had a rough go of it, man.
Yeah.
For a long time. And this isn't even talking, there's more stuff that happened in the 20th century too that isn't even covered in this table. But yeah, they had a rough go of it. So now we just have a couple last paragraphs that really summarize all this up. So we're going to run through those real quick. I think it's my turn to read, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Similarly, as Edmund Burke emphasizes, the demographic consequence of the crisis of 1878 and 1884 make it one of the capital events in the social history of modern Morocco. Maj thinks that mortality in the ports was around 15%, but in much of the countryside has easily exceeded a quarter of the population. In June 1879, the Italian consul at Tangiers estimated that a quarter of the Moroccan population had perished. This is the same percentage that Matthews presented in his report for 1878. Theodore de Cuevas, who though his many relatives in the north of the country had exceptional knowledge of the local conditions, believed that 1/3 of the population of the Garb was killed by the epidemic of 1878 to 1879. That's just, we kind of gave like a concluding, statement on the other ones, and there was one for Morocco, so I included that. If you want to go to the next one, I believe this is the one for Brazil. Johnny, would you like to take this?
Brazil. Modern Brazilians still refer to the events of 1876 to 1879 as simply the Grande Seca.
Yes.
Quote, the greatest drama of human suffering in the nation's history. Fully half of Sierra State perished, and the only transferable capital left by 1880 was in slaves. Of the dead in 1877 and 1879, says the Brazilian historian Edmar Morel, quote, it has been calculated that 150,000 died of outright starvation, 100,000 from fever and other diseases, 80,000 from smallpox, and 180,000 from poisonous or otherwise harmful food. It has also been characterized as, quote, the most costly natural disaster in the history of the Western Hemisphere.
All
and
right.
like that part where it's just like people are so starving they're like possibly knowingly eating plants that will basically blind them. I don't know if permanently or not, but like that's a lot. That's a lot where it's just like, like once you start eating the plant and you're going to go blind, like what are you going to do once you're blind? You're already like just basically starving to death.
Pretty much delirious from desperation and starvation and thirst at that point.
Yeah.
Logic isn't really functioning at that point because you're just so
desperation. Yeah.
Desperate, yeah. All right. One last text and we're wrapping it up, boys. Philbo, take us home.
Global mortality can only be estimated as a level of magnitude. Arup Maharatna, in a recent systematic review of demographic debates and literature in both India and China, points to a combined Asian mortality range of between more than 20 million and 25 million famine-related deaths. No greater precision seems possible. That's such a huge number. Like
this is as close as you're gonna get.
Yeah, and like as an estimate too. Like, wow. What is certain is simply the staggering scale. Yeah, of what I was just saying. And worldwide synchronization of starvation is unprecedented since the four horsemen of the apocalypse cut swaths of famine, war, pestilence, and death through Europe and China in the early 14th and mid 17th centuries.
Well, all I can say is that I'm fucking exhausted from reading through this slog of absolutely depressing and horrifying events that I knew almost nothing about before I read this book. Yeah. I hope that whoever is watching this, you have also, persisted through the misery of and depression of this situation to educate yourself a little bit on some of the things that have happened, that some of the things that your country may have done, that the economic system that you are a part of may have been a part of. You know what I mean? And it's important that we learn these things. I hope you enjoyed learning along with us, despite the extremely, extremely grim content that comes along with it. we're going to be signing off. Check us out in the next episode. We will be back with another chapter of Mike Davis's Late Victorian Holocausts. Make sure you're following us on Twitch. If you're not subscribed to the YouTube, like just click the fucking button. It's not that it's like it literally
hit the fucking bell.
You know, like it, leave a comment, all that stuff. And also, we're trying out different stuff. We're trying out different ways of production. You know, obviously, we had way more text on the screen this time. If you think we need to, we probably do need to reduce the amount of text on the screen a little bit. But also, just please, you know, any feedback is so greatly appreciated at this point. Definitely hit us up. If you want to support us, sign up on Patreon. That would be super cool. And we'll probably shout you out at the end of the video, right, Philbo?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, awesome. So that's it, guys. Johnny, do you want to sign us off with the catchphrase?
To all our Habibis, Habibtis, all our neither and in betweenies, La Salam out there, stay strong, all right? See you soon.
So don't run around here trying to make friends with somebody who's depriving you of your rights. They're not your friends. No, they're your enemies. And treat them like that and fight them, and you'll get your freedom. My repertoire is USSR. Be a low style, be a low style, got thrown out the car. Guys with subversive plots. They'll call you an extremist or subversive or red radical. Guys with subversive plots. Red radical. And fight them. Capitalism and democracy. Capitalism and democracy are not synonymous. We group us up like ants in a colony. Organize the wealth into a socialist economy. A way of life based off the common needs. And all my comrades is ready, we just spreading the seed. And all my comrades is ready, we just spreading the seed. And all my